an imaginative and an experiential Platonism, I suppose, and perhaps that's a response partly to some of the things that John just mentioned. Because the imagination is deeply connected to our spiritual nature, and art is an activity in which symbols are held within the sensuous frame of the visible world and participate in a higher plane of invisible reality through the craft of things made, seen and heard. And I'd like to talk today about the intuition of permanence and of the vision that the poet, artist or philosopher can develop to find what is enduring and lasting, especially amidst the flux of digital culture and technology. And our capacity to intuit these realities is a gift that's bestowed on us by divine likeness. As Philip Sherard writes, by virtue of the fact that man is created in the image of God, he is also a creator, a maker, an artist. Indeed, this is his distinguishing role, that which is capable of making him holy. As we've heard across the couple of days, there's a sense of a crisis of meaning of the material, secular world. But I think we observe a certain yearning for transcendence, recognising in art a feeling, an amnesis, another world. And with altered vision, this other noetic world appears in the theophany of the cosmos. We are each of us an intelligible cosmos, as Plotinus says. And it's because the imagination shapes the soul's journey towards the transcendent that we see reflected back in the living forms and energies of life a world beyond this one. Vision or imagination, as William Blake wrote, is a representation of what eternally exists, really and unchangeably. Plotinus writes that souls in a way are amphibious. They live part of their life in the intelligible world and part of their life in the sensible world. And today, with AI, with virtual reality, in the 21st century we live across two different kinds of worlds. They're worlds which I suppose have become the real and the virtual, but in a sense they've become a subdivision of the sensible world, or only one of Plotinus's worlds. And in place of the intelligible world, another reality is imagined, a kind of technological transcendence within the digital architectures of the machine. And many ask if Platonism or theology are relevant to modern art, and many perhaps might say they're not. What I'm going to argue today is that this is mistaken, because the Platonic tradition is a way of living that might help us to confront challenges of today. It's an active tradition of contemplation that allows focus in a time of fragmentation and of accelerated change. And it's a tradition, moreover, as we've learned and heard, that shares many characteristics with the ancient wisdom of spiritual thought the world over. And importantly, as I've mentioned, it's an imaginative tradition. And as we shape our world through our creative acts, so too we shape our inner world. And Plotinus in Ennead 1:6, how then can you see the kind of beauty that a good soul has? Go back into yourself and look. If you do not yet see yourself as beautiful, then be like a sculptor who, making a statue that is supposed to be beautiful, removes a part here and polishes a part there. Do not stop working on your statue until the divine splendour of virtue shines in you. I'd like to connect some threads in my talk of the Platonic tradition with themes in my own creative practice. And I'll propose some links between Platonism and art in the digital world. I'll discuss a selection of some of my own work in relation to two main aspects of Platonism: light as an image of participation, and ascent in the form of the flight to transcendence. I'll move between Platonic thought, Christian Neoplatonism, and theological mysticism. For my creative intuitions as an artist have led me to philosophy, to a unity of art and life, and to a mode of spiritual and contemplative experience that leads to the heights above being. The love of wisdom is one path, and the love of beauty is another. Sherard again wrote, "There is no split between our imagination and our reason, or between art and metaphysics. Both are concerned with identical realities. The only difference between them lies in the way they express these realities." And the idea that art and philosophy form a kind of unity in the Platonic tradition is of course not without precedent. Hilary Armstrong, translator of the Enneads, remarks that a painting by his brother, the artist John Armstrong, was, he said, the best illustration he'd ever seen to any part of the Enneads. This image, says Armstrong, is like dreaming nature in Ennead 3.8 on nature, contemplation and the one. And here, of course, Plotinus writes of falling from contemplation, the one as the productive power of all things, and where the beauty of intellect, the most beautiful of all, lies in a pure ray of light, whose shadow and image is also seen in this beautiful universe of ours. John Armstrong was part of an artists group called Unit 1, and this was founded by Paul Nash and linked to 20th century modernism in Britain. And Hilary Armstrong, interestingly, collaborated with the artist David Jones on a Dominican calendar, and there's a version of this calendar in the University of Cambridge library. Jones was a Christian artist who argued that art is a showing forth, a form of recollection and anamnesis, he used the word. And like Sherard, Jones held that the creative imagination was a vital part of our spiritual nature. He wrote about the alienation from sacred revelation in modern technological societies, saying that man is of his essential nature a poeta, one who makes things that are signs of something. How can there be a manual act that makes anamnesis unless man is man the maker, and thus poiesis his native and authentic mode of apperception? And in my creative interests, I've long considered art and philosophy to be a kind of shared path to an understanding and apperception of eternity. They share the character of a knowledge that transcends discursive thought. The arts have been a vehicle for Platonic thought, and this is something I'm very interested in. And let's read you a quote here from the poet and Blake scholar Kathleen Raine. Quite a remarkable quote. She says, "Plato is the philosopher of the arts. The Platonic philosophy is the necessary basis of all imaginative art. The Platonic tradition has lived on as the learning of the poets, like a secret language. Together with the philosophy are associated those gods, myths, symbolic figures, and stories which not only Plato himself, but Plotinus and all the later Platonic philosophers employ. The Platonic artist and poet philosophize. The Platonic philosopher mythologizes." Eva Brann asks why a painter or a poet might not vault to a non-dialectical contemplations of forms. And she described Socrates and Plato as philosophical poets who know how to engage in image making, in capturing and bringing down into appearance the highest beings in the realm of images. Stanley Rosen has argued for a dramatic and poetic reading of the dialogues. And J.A. Stewart, in his Myths of Plato, speaks of myth and images eliciting what he calls transcendental feeling. In the 1960 re-edition of Stewart's book, G.R. Levy comments that Plato's method is that of salvation by imaginative participation in the world of forms or ideas. And she wrote a novel called Plato in Sicily, imagining Plato's journey there, and pictures him in a moment of inspired vision on Mount Etna, where he realizes, quote, that his most exalted speculations could never receive their complete form in dialectic alone. He would require the symbolic language of myth. And of course, the question of the activity of the poet, and we could say more broadly the artist, arises in different dialogues, Republic, Ion, the Timaeus, this passage. Whenever the craftsman looks at what is always changeless, and using a thing of that kind as his model, reproduces its form and character, then of necessity all that he so completes is beautiful. But were he to look at a thing that has come to be, and use as his model something that has been begotten, his work will lack beauty. And of course, Plato commends those poets who compose hymns to the gods. As Sherard has noted, it's not all artists then, but particular artists to whom this criticism is directed. Artists who only direct their work to the ephemeral material world and not to the eternal forms. We see in Plotinus a slightly different take on this in some senses, where there's discussion of an inner vision which guides the artist's creation. And here, this is in reference to this image, Ennead 5.8. If someone lacks respect for crafts on the grounds that they make imitations of nature, it should be said first that natural things imitate other things. Next, one should know that it is not simply that which is seen that they imitate, but they go back to the express principles from which nature comes. Next as well, one should know that the crafts produce many things by themselves, and as they possess beauty, they supply whatever is missing, as in the case of Phidias too, who did not produce his statue of Zeus according to anything sensible, but grasping what he would be if Zeus wanted to appear before our eyes. Here then there's a combination of an inner noetic vision and outer sensuous vision which unite in artistic form iconically, representing to differing degrees a likeness of the divine. Looking at the visible world, we see beyond to another invisible world. Looking inside, we discover an intelligible world whose images we perceive as intimations of the invisible. And the inner and outer movement of visibility and invisibility constitute the creative act. Sherard says that by raising his intelligence towards intelligible realities, and by apprehending or intuiting them in his vision, the artist will allow the radiations of their presence to flow into and to inform his work. And as Blake says, man's perceptions are not bounded by organs of perception. He perceives more than sense can discover. So in this way, the material or sensible world is an image that participates in intelligible realities. Art, as I've said in reference to Jones, is anamnesis, and it's also iconographic. The divine archetypes participate in and give life to sacred images. Vladimir Lossky writes that holy images express things in themselves invisible, and they render them really present, visible and active. They are a material centre in which there reposes an energy, a divine force which unites itself to human art. And I've alluded here, of course, to the Christian teaching of the image and likeness to God, and this is connected to the nature of human creativity. Plotinus, of course, also speaks of becoming like the one, or of the seer becoming one with what is seen. And in the icon, we find this presence, this energy to which Lossky refers. And I would mention briefly here the archaeal poieton, the image made without hands, insofar as this arises both out of the artist's sensible perception, but also out of a visionary or contemplative experience. In the Mandylion icon, or in images of the Veil of Veronica, we find this numinal trace, this divine presence. And the icon, of course, is a very special and particular form of sacred art with a liturgical function. But non-liturgical religious art can also embody a kind of participatory likeness or energy. Sherard writes wonderfully on this and talks of Platonic art as being iconographical. That is a mode of art that he says is normal to all cultures with a living religious tradition. This is the making of an image as a copy of a model of an archetype where there is a kinship and a presence of the one within the other. There is a real sharing or participation of the image in the archetypal reality that is shown forth. The image is this archetypal reality in another form, says Sherard. So my work has taken many forms over the years, over many years. In recent years I've developed various processes that employ traditional media and digital media in dialogue with one another. Works are made through drawing, both on paper and on computer, by using traditional relief print methods, digital printing and scanning, and different kinds of digital image editing. I've worked with film, with video, with photography, and with different kinds of projections of colour, of light, and of video. And some of the work I've been making recently has been quite influenced and inspired by the idea of flight, by winged figures, by mystical philosophy and theology. I think of the Phaedrus myth, where beauty, wisdom and goodness nourish the soul's wings, of Dionysius the Areopagite, who writes of the good as a firm, transcendent beam which draws sacred minds upwards to becoming like it, where those that do so take flight. John Scotus Eriogena, the spiritual bird is fast flying, God-seeing, ascends beyond all visible and invisible creation, passes through all thought and intellect, and deified enters into God who deifies him. Dante writes of a need to fly with the swift wings and plumage of great desire, and of how his feathers grow for flight. And Blake speaks of imagination and the fiery chariot of contemplative thought. I read this remarkable passage by Valentin Tomberg recently. The bird flies by beating its wings against the air, by resting on the air. The angel flies by immobilizing its wings after having touched God. One wing holds him in contact with divine understanding, and the other with divine memory or imagination. The two wings are therefore related to the contemplative and creative aspects of God, which in their turn correspond to the divine image and likeness in man. And so here, and it was a great honour, by the way, to have this image on the programme, so thank you very much. Light is a very important factor in my work, and I'm interested in light in both a material, sensible sense and also a metaphysical sense. This work began as a drawing, and it became a digital drawing, something very multi-layered, based upon a kind of contemplative vision of light, of flight, of wings, of dazzling colours, of movement, of light. I thought about this in relation to stained glass windows and the transformation of light and space, of how visible light intimates the unknowable light. And the shaping of sensible light, one makes out shapes, I think, that appear from beyond material things. Just a selection of some images here of windows. This is one of Blake's illustrations to the Divine Comedy. The passage in the comedy that accompanies this, Dante writes of seeing a light in the form of a river pouring its splendour. And I've attempted in some of my work recently to try to visualise moments of a kind of delicate light, something kind of barely seen, with shapes emerging from the brilliance. Might barely show on the screen here, but again, this relates to the broadly Platonic tradition and some of the interests I've cited. So Dionysius the Areopagite speaks of the transcendent beam, and light transmits a divine message. Faith, hope, and love are pictured one as a ray, one as light, and one as a disc by John Climacus in The Ladder of Divine Ascent. And some of my works have been moving projections of light with shifting fields of colour and pattern, fields of vision, if you like, that invite a kind of participatory experience. Particularly, I hope, in reimagining our relationship to digital media, and this is a still from a large kind of moving projection of light. And as you can see, I refer here to the circle, to the tondo, and to the light of the sun, and the oculus of the dome. In this icon, we see a cosmic image of circularity. I refer to divine vision, or what Plato termed the eye of the soul, and here's Blake's images of the chariot and the Divine Comedy. For Plotinus, says Pierre Hadot, when vision becomes spiritual, there is no longer any distinction between inner and outer light. Vision is light and light is vision. There is a kind of self-vision of light in which light is, as it were, transparent to itself. And nowhere have I found this expressed more profoundly than in Plotinus, where he says, the one who sees has a kinship with that which is seen, and he must make himself the same as it if he is to attain the sight. For no eye has ever seen the sun without becoming sunlight, nor could a soul ever see beauty without becoming beautiful. And I think too perhaps of Socrates praying to the sun in the Symposium. I've also been very influenced by the writings of the Philokalia, the hesychastic tradition. For instance, St. Simeon writes, solitary, one who is unmixed with the world and continually speaks with God alone. Seeing he is seen, loving he is loved, and he becomes light, glittering unspeakably. Or St. Gregory Palamas, that man being himself light, sees the light with the light. So this image on the screen, which is a variation of the other, was one I actually made in the moments when I was composing these very lines for the talk. I was moving between making the work and writing, as I often do actually. And this is a print image, so it's going to be printed, but I'm adapting it also into a large light projection where each of these levels will be sort of animated and moving and shifting in different kind of patterns of movement. And Blake spoke of a sort of double vision of the sun, which was at once sensible and also noetic, a vision of angelic realities. And so, as you've seen, on the one hand, there's a certain kind of abstraction to my work, but I think there's always an element of abstraction in the visionary experience and depictions of the artist, a way, if you like, to use the momentary or the visible to portray, however inadequately, the eternal and the invisible. Perhaps this might be the simple light of which Dante speaks, unable to express the magnitude of his vision. It's the apophatic. And I feel that in making these works, I perhaps capture only something momentary, a kind of recollection, images that derive from contemplation. I think of them as sketches or intimations of some sort. I don't see them as being representations of Platonic doctrines or depictions of theological ideas. And of course, as we hear from Plato in the seventh letter, that there aren't any doctrines that are written or spoken of. They're brought to birth in the soul on a sudden as light that is kindled by a leaping spark. And something of this kind of thing emerges in being creative or imaginative. So just in this last section now, I wanted to return to the question I posed earlier on about whether art Platonism and religion have a meaningful relationship in the modern world and in modern art, in fact. And this is a question also connected, I think, to whether digital art or modern media have anything to add to the traditional media with which sacred art has been mainly realised. And there's a sense, I suppose, that certain kinds of art transcend time. They seem to have a quality that is continuous. But the kinds of traditional modes of art in which these forms were made were in historical terms, I think, integral with the overall social, cultural and spiritual consciousness of different times and places, which today perhaps, certainly in many modern technological societies, is not so much the case. And so alongside those traditional modes, perhaps the artist might use the tools and modes of perception available today to express these spiritual realities in other ways. In the flux of flickering electronic light lies the contemplative stillness of eternity. Technology could enable us to mediate our experience and, used in imaginative ways, perhaps overcome its instrumental tendencies to point us back to higher things. Even the flitter of screens might hold the promise of transcendence. In an article that Sherard published in 1982, he comments on the role of the artist in non-traditional societies. If art is only the utility of an instrumental culture, he suggests, and if its makers understand themselves only in naturalistic terms, then their art expresses nothing greater than the fleetingness of material existence. Art for Sherard is a reflection of the image that forms self and society, and the worldview of that society is what determines the shape of the artwork that it expresses. In cultures that reduce humans to machines, the resulting art will be of a kind that further fragments and distances humans from the divine. In modern technological societies, Sherard says, there can be no art that manifests transcendent vision and experience, no art that possesses a sacred quality, until there are artists who have first rediscovered how to live a way of life in which their realization is possible. He says, as everything rightly seen mirrors the eternal, and as everything rightly seen is a symbol of a higher level of reality, a work of art may use a symbolism little related to that of a traditional liturgical art, and may still act as a bridge between the material and spiritual, earth and heaven, and may still possess a sacred quality and function. An artist whose intention and attention is concentrated on the discovery and expression of spiritual principles within and without may well be given moments of revelation and illumination, intimations and intuitions of eternity, and so transfigure the material of their art with that beauty and rhythm which are the hallmark of the sacred. And he wrote this years really before the technological revolutions of the internet and recent times, but the challenges he evokes remain present. How, I suppose you might ask, amidst the changeable and transient digital culture can the artist compose hymns to the gods? And what Sherard writes of, and what I think Platonism suggests, certainly in how it's been the arts have been a vehicle for it, is a metaphysical concept of art, an art that is not only subject to the effects of an epoch, but transcends them, an art whose outward shape may change to some extent, but whose inner form or meaning is guided by something permanent. An artist who not only shapes a work by their intention, but by being an inspired vehicle for the transmission of truths beyond their subjectivity. And this kind of creative, imaginative thinking goes beyond the self, beyond calculating reason and understanding. It's an intuitive thinking, an experience or a way of life. In the Laws, we hear of the extent to which art corresponds correctly to its model as an image to an original, and in Cratylus that one should learn from the original as to whether the likeness is a good copy. In the making of likenesses, then, the artist moves between immanence and transcendence, art being the vehicle of transmission of the higher to the lower. And in our new age of false images, the illusory spectres of AI-generated media, it seems from the Platonic tradition that we must again revive the skill of discerning true from false likenesses by training our attention to the higher forms. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. In the modern world, faces illuminated by the light and reflection of screens lack divine participation. And unlike computers, humans are made in the image of God. St. Diadochus of Photiki writes that our likeness to God requires our cooperation. When the intellect begins to perceive the Holy Spirit with full consciousness, we should realise that grace is beginning to paint the divine likeness over the divine image in us. And this he compares with the work of the artist. In portraiture, when the full range of colours is added to the outline, the painter captures the likeness of the subject. Something similar happens to those who are being repainted by God's grace in the divine likeness. When the luminosity of love is added, then it is evident that the image has been fully transformed into the beauty of the likeness. And to conclude, whilst Gerard, who I've mentioned a number of times, was rather pessimistic about the possibility of redeeming the technological revolutions of the modern world with the traditions of the past, he was certainly correct in his assessment of the deep loss of what he called the Platonic view of art. And this he held to be the art which was truest to our spiritual nature. Man has not forfeited the divine image in which he is created, even if he fails to live and act in accordance with it, writes Gerard. He can recover what he has lost through the rebirth of divine love in his soul. And this eros, this desire to remember and to ascend, is bequeathed by the teachings of the Platonic tradition and the many interpretations and developments that have flowed from it. In the shadowy cave of the technological world, whose fleeting imagery and enticing simulations draw us downwards, we can seek to fix our gaze upon the unchanging height of brilliant light, transmitting that vision into art, conveying intelligible mysteries in sensible forms. Thank you.
I think we are over time, so we'll
thank you very much
for your